What's up, everybody? I'm sure you all know this, but covering gaming news is not exactly the easiest thing in the world. Like, I've only been kind of doing it for the past few months, and I doubt it's going to last much longer. But I see a lot of YouTubers and content creators and random journalists who are just looking for the next bit of information that they can share with everybody. Now, I'm assuming the longer they do it, the more second nature it becomes. The less they care about what the narrative might be and they just take things at face value. And the less they probably look into the sources and figure out if what they're saying is true or not. And I don't blame them, honestly. Just like any other job, it just becomes second nature. You're just going with the motions and you're just getting the news in and you're spitting it out to your audience. So while I'm making this video, I want you to understand that this is not an attack on anybody's integrity, nor is it an attack on their form of art. But I have to mention somebody specifically because they are, number one, a massive channel, and what they say ends up affecting a lot of people because many people take them very seriously. And obviously it's because this person has built up their viewer base, has a lot of integrity, and a lot of people trust them for the news, so bringing them up I don't think really is an attack. It's just kind of like, let's talk about what they're discussing, especially because it's something that is relevant to Switch 2 sales, which I happen to be tracking quite a bit. Now, mind you, this bit of news is from September 1st. I saw it a few days ago. I've seen people talk about it online already. It really wasn't anything worth commenting on, but then I noticed recently people have been coming to my channel and being like, oh, you're not mentioning Capcom and how much they're praising Nintendo and how much they were surprised by how good the sales are doing. And furthermore, people have taken this news and they've turned it around and made it seem like Capcom was saying that Sony is making it difficult for them to get people to buy their games because of how expensive the console is. And all I'm wondering is, where are people suddenly getting this news from? And lo and behold, it's because Spawnwave mentioned Capcom in their video. But obviously, I don't think he put that much effort into it because I think he just saw the news, took it at face value, and shared it with the world. And again, I understand that he covers a lot of news, and I understand that when people are trying to push pro-Nintendo marketing propaganda, it's not realistic to expect him to really dig deep into every bit of news, so I'll cut him some slack. Now, for those of you that haven't seen the news, effectively what people are going around reporting is that Capcom was so surprised by how well the Switch 2 was doing, and they're just dying to get their games over on the Nintendo Switch 2 as fast as possible, because they feel like they missed out on all of the hype and of the launch and all the massive sales and the numbers. So they're doing their best to get everything onto this console as fast as they can. They underestimated it. And furthermore, the PlayStation 5 has become such a barrier because it's too expensive. Now, let's talk about the second point first, because credit to Spawnwave, he did mention this at the end of his report. But when they're talking about a barrier for the PlayStation 5, they're speaking specifically about Japan in this regard. Obviously, since the Switch 2 is the same price as a PS5 over in the West. But prior to the Switch 2, when they had the Switch 1 and it was doing well, the PS5 was a barrier because it was more expensive than the Switch 1. That barrier doesn't really exist anywhere outside of Japan at this current time. And in Japan, keep in mind that the PS5 is already at 7 or 8 million sold, and it's on pace to match up with the PlayStation 4, which hit around 10 million, and that was not considered a failure in Japan, even if the Switch did significantly better. So they very much have a very strong user base in Japan, but obviously because things are more expensive there than the Switch 2, they do find it as a bit of a barrier. But nowhere in the interview is he insinuating that the PlayStation 5 is not selling well and it's limiting their sales numbers. All he's talking about is how prices are going up and it's making things more difficult because younger generations can't reach these dollar values. And that applies for the Nintendo Switch 2 as well. Now, the next thing here, and this is the part where Spawnwave kind of puts his own little commentary on it in the beginning. He goes on and laughs that Capcom is once again surprised that the Switch 2 is being successful because they did the same thing with the Switch 1 and they jumped in too late. But the problem is that interview has nothing to do with the Switch 2 sales numbers. And I know this because if you go back to the source and you actually read through the entire interview, you find out that the interview was conducted in late May 2025, which, if I'm not mistaken, was before the Switch 2 came out. Which means by that point in time, all we knew was that the Switch 2 was going to release in a few weeks, and most people were taking things at face value and looking at the headlines and figuring that this thing was going to be selling between 6 to 8 million units on opening weekend. And amongst those 6 to 8 million units, a lot of people had this assumption that it was going to be hitting at least 1.5 to 2 million around Japan because of all of the pre-orders. And those were just from my Nintendo store, so who knows how much more it would be selling. This is what the Capcom president was surprised about. Although that last bit is my assumption of what he was surprised about. Because the only thing we get from this interview is a single sentence where he says that the Nintendo Switch 2 was released in June 2025 at a price of 49,980 yen, and the response was better than we had expected. So he might not even be surprised about what I'm saying. He might just be surprised that people around the world were excited for the Switch 2 still. It's such a nothing burger of a statement, and somehow you got people running around the internet right now going that Capcom is saying that they're amazed that the Switch 2 reached 6 million units in 7 weeks, and we're ready to get as many games as possible on there, and the PlayStation 5 is a barrier to everybody, and it's not helping our case in selling games, even though they sold 10 million frickin' copies of Monster Hunter World in the first month, and it's already at close to 30 million copies sold. This is such a ridiculous bit of news. Mind you, the interview is very good. I highly recommend everybody actually goes to the source and, your browsers can translate the Japanese thing to English, and read the interview. He talks a lot about the market, he talks about their launch, he talks about so many different things. But my big takeaway from his interview is he's just surprised that when they upped the price of the Nintendo Switch 2, there wasn't a bigger backlash. I'm guessing he wasn't subscribed to my channel. But it's funny because even he realizes that the Switch 2 is overpriced, and he's like, are people crazy? They're actually gonna buy this? But yeah, effectively, a lot of them did. I don't think it's enough, but we'll find out. But it's hilarious to me right now because the Switch 2 propaganda is so high, and everybody is just trying to get as many articles out there to make this thing's hype up, and they've been doing it since prior to the console's launch. I don't feel like looking up how much money Nintendo spent on marketing this year, but damn did they spend a pretty penny. But just like with almost every bit of news that has come out since the Switch 2 has launched until now, you hear something, people report on it, they run away with it, it's the biggest bit of news, and then of course later on they don't correct anything. Fastest selling console in Japan, except when they corrected everything and it turns out it wasn't. Final Fantasy VII is going to be 60 frames per second, except it turns out that it actually ends up being 30 frames per second. Capcom was surprised by the Switch 2 sales, except no they're not, that was a statement that was made before the Switch 2 had even sold a single unit. The Switch 2's LCD is better than the OLED, except, oh no, it's actually worse than the actual Nintendo Switch 1's LCD. And now everyone's gonna start talking about how good Star Wars Outlaws looks because of a Nintendo Life video. And look, I love gamers, I want you guys to enjoy it, and I really hope that Star Wars Outlaws is as good as Nintendo Life is trying to sell it right now. But I would wait until I start dancing about a victory lap for Star Wars Outlaws, because the same thing could happen like what happened with Final Fantasy. Or like what happened when they said they were going to get parity with all the EA games on the Switch, and it turns out they run at 30 frames per second, and for people that actually play the games a lot, many of them don't like that. Or of course how every single Switch 2 edition that people end up buying ends up being disappointing in one way or another. Many people are just way too quick to make victory laps here. But the media, it's pushing such a good agenda for Nintendo, it's hilarious. I mean, think about it. In mid-August, everybody was talking about how Nintendo's stock had reached an all-time high in Japan. I think Stealth had reported on it on Twitter. And everybody was coming to my channel and being like, I don't know how you think that this thing is actually not doing that well if the stock is at all-time high. Well, just so you know, the stock has shot back down. It's now lower than it was in the entirety of August. And it looks like that it hit the peak in mid-August and it's going downwards. Actually, I think the share value of Nintendo is probably a direct correlation to the fake hype that's been going all around. It's starting to seem like that first or second week of August is when the glass shattered for a lot of people and this thing is starting to go downwards. Might bounce back up, maybe with a Nintendo Direct, depending on what happens there. But everyone is ignoring the fact that the share value at the start of September is lower than it was basically at the end of July. That's a downwards trend. And Nintendo, as we know, only cares about their share value. So this is very real and very important to discuss. Because if October hits and that continues to trend downwards, and then November hits and that continues to trend downwards, well, all of a sudden, maybe the Nintendo Switch 2 is actually not doing that well for Nintendo. But even then, I don't expect any of these news channels or any of these reporters online or any of these big Twitter guys or YouTube guys to consider discussing any nuance. Especially considering 2 years ago, a lot of these pro-Nintendo YouTubers that right now are the biggest glazers for the Nintendo Switch 2 were being very critical towards the Nintendo Switch 1 because that's what was getting a lot of clicks. And they were criticizing a lot of things about the Nintendo Switch 1 that has yet to be fixed with the Nintendo Switch 2. And now they're mute. They move with the media. They go with the wind. If you guys think I am being harsh towards Nintendo, and if you guys think that I'm being critical and overly critical about every little detail for the Switch 2, just wait until that storm shifts in the opposite direction. These are the same people that were hating on the Switch 2 every single day up until the Switch 2 launched, and then went out and bought every single thing and started to report on it. You don't think they're gonna completely backtrack on all of the glaze they've been doing for the past few months as soon as this thing trips over a rock? The media machine is hard at work, and it's doing a great job. But there is a massive reason why between all of the press press and all of the headlines and all of the glaze, you see between the cracks so many people that are extremely disappointed and very upset with the anti-consumer practices and the absolute debacle that is the Switch 2, and specifically the prices related around the console, the stupidity behind the dumb game key cards, the embarrassing sales and performance of third parties, and obviously the banning, the bricking, the PAL World, all of that stuff that is just not getting enough attention that it should be getting. But yeah, long story short, Capcom is not impressed by Nintendo Switch 2's sale. They might be impressed by it now, but what they were impressed by was the pre-Switch 2 hype, and prior to the Switch 2 coming out, a lot of people thought it was going to be selling way more than it did in the first month.